The evening conversation studio buzzed with energy as the crew made final preparations. Red lights blinked on cameras. People rushed around with clipboards and headsets. Tonight was special. It's very special. John Miller paced back and forth behind the stage. His hands were sweaty, and he kept checking his notes. After 23 years as a talk show host, John rarely got nervous anymore. But tonight was different. Tonight, Clint Eastwood was his guest. 5 minutes, everyone. Called Susan White, the show's producer. Susan had worked hard to get Clint on the show. It had taken months of calls, emails, and promises. The famous actor and director almost never did interviews anymore. At 94 years old, he was very selective about his public appearances. "How's Mai Tai?" John asked, turning to Susan. "Perfect," she said with a smile. "Remember, keep it light." Asked about the new movie first, then his directing career, then maybe some memories from his early days. Nothing political unless he brings it up. John nodded. He knew the plan. Everyone wanted this interview to go well. The network executives were watching closely. Ratings had been down lately, and a successful interview with someone as legendary as Clint Eastwood could change everything. In the audience area, 300 people waited excitedly. Many had stood in line for hours to get tickets. Betty Morgan, a 65-year-old retired teacher, had driven 6 hours from another state just to be here. "I've loved him since I was a teenager," Betty told the woman sitting next to her. "From the westerns to those detective movies to his wonderful work as a director. He's an American treasure." The woman, Nancy Clark, nodded in agreement. "My husband and I watched all his films. Frank passed away last year, but he would have loved to be here tonight." The studio lights dimmed. The audience fell quiet. The show's theme music played. John walked out to applause, waving and smiling. "Good evening, everyone." "Welcome to Evening Conversations. I'm John Miller, and tonight we have a very special guest, a man who has defined American cinema for decades as an actor and a director. Please welcome the legendary Clint Eastwood." The audience stood up, clapping and cheering loudly. The famous theme music from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly played as Clint Eastwood walked slowly onto the stage. Despite his age, he moved with confidence. His face was lined with wrinkles that told stories of a long, full life. He wore a simple blue shirt, tan jacket, and dark pants. Nothing flashy. That wasn't his style. John shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Eastwood, it's an absolute honor to have you here." "Call me Clint," the legend said as he sat down. His voice was quiet but clear, with that famous slight rasp that millions of movie fans would recognize anywhere. "The honor's mine," Clint added with a small smile. "You've got a good show here. I watch it sometimes." John tried not to look too surprised or pleased. "Well, that makes my year to hear that." In the control room, Susan and her team watched the monitor's camera too. "Get a tighter shot," she said into her headset. "This is going perfectly so far." The first 10 minutes of the interview went exactly as planned. John asked about Clint's latest project, a film about a retired rodeo rider. Reconnecting with his estranged daughter, Clint answered thoughtfully, occasionally making the audience laugh with his dry humor. "You know, at my age, stories about looking back and making peace become more important," Clint said. "This character, he's stubborn like many I've played, but he's learning that pride isn't worth losing family over." The audience listened carefully to every word. Many took pictures with their phones even though they had been asked not to. Security guards watched, but didn't interfere. "This was a special night. Your career spans over 60 years, John said. From television westerns to the Dollars trilogy, from Dirty Harry to your award-winning work as a director. Is there any role or film you're most proud of?" Clint thought for a moment. "That's like asking which of your children you love most." The audience laughed. "But I will say that the films that pushed me out of my comfort zone often ended up being the most rewarding." Paul Davis, a film student sitting in the back row, recorded every word in a small notebook. He couldn't believe his luck. His film professor had given him a ticket at the last minute. This would make an amazing paper for his class on American cinema. As the interview continued, John felt more relaxed. Clint was answering questions fully. The audience was engaged, and the atmosphere was warm. Then, seemingly from nowhere, the conversation took an unexpected turn. You know, Clint said after answering a question about working with different actors. I was reading about the new Pope, Robert Prevost, the other day. John blinked. This wasn't on his list of talking points. From the corner of his eye, he could see Susan in the wings, looking equally surprised. But John was a professional. He knew to follow the guest's lead, especially when that guest was Clint Eastwood. "Oh," John said encouragingly. "What caught your interest about him?" "Well, there's something about his leadership style," Clint continued. "He reminds me of some of the best directors I've worked with over the years. Humble, you know, not making it about himself, but still with a clear vision of where he wants to go." The audience had gone completely silent. Nobody had expected Clint Eastwood to bring up the Pope during this interview. Many looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Was Clint Eastwood religious? He had never spoken much about faith publicly. In the control room, the production team watched in amazement. "Are we really talking about the Pope right now?" whispered Alan Porter, the assistant producer, to nobody in particular, Mary Johnson. The social media manager was typing frantically on her phone. "Twitter is exploding," she said. "This is going viral already." Back on stage, John decided to explore this unexpected topic. "That's an interesting comparison. Leadership in filmmaking and in the church. Do you see parallels there?" Clint nodded slowly. "It's more than you might think. Both require guiding large groups of people toward a common goal. Both need vision and humility. The worst leaders in both fields are the ones who make it all about themselves." Betty Morgan in the audience felt tears in her eyes, though she couldn't exactly explain why. There was something powerful about hearing this American icon speak so thoughtfully about leadership and faith. Next to her, Nancy Clark was recording the moment on her phone, forgetting completely about the no recording rule. "What specifically about Pope Prevost stands out to you?" John asked, genuinely curious now. His background, Clint replied. "American, but spent decades in Peru. He knows what real life is like for regular people. He's not stuck in an ivory tower. That kind of experience shapes how you see the world, how you connect with others." Susan White had moved from the wings to stand directly behind the main camera now. She spoke quietly into her headset. "Stay with this. Don't cut away. This is gold." The studio was completely still. 300 people barely breathed as they listened to Clint Eastwood talk about the Pope with unexpected knowledge and respect. Even the cameramen, who had seen countless celebrities come and go, were transfixed. "I never expected to be discussing religion with Clint Eastwood," John said with a small laugh. Trying to acknowledge how unusual this moment was, Clint smiled. That famous half-smile that had charmed movie audiences for decades. "Life's full of surprises, isn't it? It's just when you think you've got someone figured out." The audience broke into spontaneous applause. Whatever their own religious beliefs, they recognized they were witnessing something authentic and unexpected. In an age of carefully scripted celebrity interviews, this moment of genuine reflection stood out. John Miller knew, in that moment, that this interview would be remembered for years to come. What had started as a standard conversation about movies had transformed into something much more meaningful. And they were only 20 minutes into an hour-long show. The control room of evening conversations was normally a place of calm, professional focus. Not tonight. Tonight it buzzed with excited whispers and hurried movements as the production team watched. Clint Eastwood continued his unexpected discussion. About Pope Robert Prevost. "Did anyone know he was interested in the Pope?" Susan White asked, her eyes fixed on the monitor. Alan Porter shook his head. "Nothing in any of the pre-interview research. Nothing." Mary Johnson held up her phone too. "Show Susan. Look at these numbers. We've never seen social media engagement like this. Ever." On the main stage, John Miller leaned forward in his chair. The initial shock of Eastwood's topic change had passed, and now he was genuinely curious. This was turning into one of the most authentic conversations he'd ever had on air. "You mentioned Pope Prevost's background in Peru," John said. "Do you follow world events closely these days?" Clint nodded. "More than I used to. When you get to my age, you start paying attention to different things. The bigger picture. Who's guiding us? Who's making decisions that affect ordinary people?" The audience, Betty Morgan, nudged Nancy Clark. Never knew he cared about these things, she whispered. Nancy nodded. Frank would have loved this. He always said there was more depth to Eastwood than people gave him credit for. The camera panned across the audience, capturing their rapt expressions. No one was checking phones or whispering to neighbors. Every person was completely focused on the conversation happening on stage. What specifically about Pope Prevost? Leadership style reminds you of good directors you've known. John asked. Clint thought for a moment. His face, lined with age but still handsome, showed he was taking the question seriously. Good directors listen, he said finally. They don't just tell everyone what to do. They create a space where people can do their best work. From what I've read, that's how Prevost operates. He's not rushing to make big changes or put his stamp on everything. He's listening first. Behind camera 3, Sam Rogers, a young production assistant who had only been with the show for 2 months, stood perfectly still. He was Catholic, and hearing Clint Eastwood talk about the Pope with such insight made him feel strangely emotional. I know our audience would be curious, John continued. Is faith something that's important to you personally? You've rarely spoken about it in interviews? A hint of Eastwood's famous half-smile appeared. I keep some things private, always have. But I'll say this, as you get older, you think more about what it all means. The bigger questions. And I might not go to church every Sunday, but I pay attention to people who seem genuine in their beliefs. In the sound booth above the studio, Richard Edwards adjusted the audio levels carefully. After 30 years in television, he knew he was witnessing something special. This is why I love live TV, he said quietly to himself. Meanwhile, in homes across America, viewers were calling family members into their living rooms. You have to see this, Linda Harris told her husband as he walked in from the kitchen. Clint. Eastwood is talking about the Pope on John Miller's show, and it's absolutely fascinating. Back in the studio, John decided to explore the connection further. You've played many characters who have a strong moral code, even if they operate outside conventional rules. Do you see any parallels between those characters and religious leadership? Clint chuckled, a warm sound that made the audience smile. That's an interesting question. I never thought about it that way. But yes, maybe. Those characters, they cut through the noise, don't they? They see what matters. The best religious leaders do that too. They remind us what's important beyond all the distractions. Susan White spoke quietly into her headset. Get ready to extend the segment. We're going to push back the commercial. Break. On the monitor that showed the network executive's viewing room, Susan could see Jerry Phillips, the head of programming, leaning forward in his chair. He looked pleased, very pleased. The ratings must be through the roof, Alan whispered. In the audience, Paul Davis, the film student, was scribbling frantically in his notebook. His film professor would never believe this. The paper he had planned to write about, Eastwood's directorial techniques, was transforming into something much more interesting. An analysis of moral philosophy in Eastwood's work and words. Miller felt a rare sense of professional satisfaction. In a career filled with thousands of interviews, this was becoming one of his most memorable. You mentioned you've been reading about Pope Prevost, John said. What sparked that interest? It started with a news article, Clint replied. About his work in Peru before becoming Pope. He lived simply there, worked with regular folks. That caught my attention. Then I found myself reading more. One article led to another. As he spoke, the audience noticed how animated Eastwood had become. For a man known for his understated style, this was as close to passionate as they had ever seen him. There was a story about him visiting a prison in Lima, Clint continued. Not with cameras and reporters. Just him, talking to inmates, listening to them. That stuck with me. In the back of the audience, Carol Wilson wiped a tear from her eye. Her son was in prison, and the thought of the Pope visiting inmates touched her deeply. She had come tonight because her late husband had been an Eastwood fan. Now, she felt like she was meant to be here for an entirely different reason. The monitors in the control room showed social media exploding with reactions. Hashtag Eastwood Pope is trending #1 nationally, Mary reported. And look at these comments. People are connecting to this on a really deep level. Susan scrolled through the feed on Mary's phone. Never expected Clint Eastwood to make me think about faith tonight. This is the most real celebrity interview I've seen in years. Watching with my 80-year-old dad, who's both a Catholic and an Eastwood fan, he's speechless. John glanced at his notes, then set them aside. The prepared questions seemed irrelevant. Now this conversation had taken on a life of its own. You've directed films that explore complex moral questions, John said. East and West and Letters from Iwo Jima and Flags of Our Fathers. Revenge versus Justice and Unforgiven. Do you see Pope Prevost addressing similar complexities in today's world? Clint nodded slowly. The world isn't black and white. Never. Has been. The best stories and the best leaders acknowledge that. They don't offer simple answers to complicated questions. That's what I respect about him. Seems to understand the gray areas where most of us actually live. The camera. Cut to the audience, where people nodded in agreement. In a divided world, these words resonated. Peter Collins, a lighting technician who had worked on the show for 15 years, found himself completely distracted from his job, someone who had grown up watching Eastwood's films with his father. Hearing the actor speak so thoughtfully about leadership and morality felt like a gift. We're getting calls from other networks, Alan whispered to Susan. They want permission to use clips from this interview. CNN, Fox, everyone. Susan nodded. Tell them we'll discuss it after the show. This is going to be huge. On stage, the conversation continued to flow naturally. Both men seemed to have forgotten the cameras, the audience, the millions watching at home. It had become a genuine exchange of ideas between two people from very different worlds. In your films, John? Said there's often a moment when a character has to make a difficult choice that reveals who they truly are. Do you think that's true in real life too? That our choices define us? Absolutely, Clint replied without hesitation. We're the choices we make, especially the hard ones, when no one's watching, when there's a cost involved. I think that's true for everyone, movie characters, ordinary people, and yes, religious leaders too. As he finished speaking, the studio fell completely silent. For a brief moment, 300 people collectively held their breath, absorbing his words. Then, spontaneously, they began to applaud. The applause finally died down in the studio. John Miller glanced at the small clock visible from his seat. They were supposed to go to a commercial break 5 minutes ago, but no one had signaled him to wrap up. This conversation was too valuable to interrupt, Clint said, his voice a bit softer now. I think what draws me to Prevost is that he seems real. No fancy talk, no big shows of power, just a man trying to do good work. John nodded. That actually sounds a lot like how people describe you on movie sets. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the audience.
Oh.
Clint smiled and shrugged slightly. Maybe that's why I notice it in others, he admitted. In the front row, a man named Greg Harris listened with special interest. Greg worked as a counselor at a youth center in a tough neighborhood. He had used Eastwood films many times to start discussions with teenage boys about manhood and responsibility. Hearing Eastwood connect these ideas to faith and leadership felt like a gift he could take back to his work. Meanwhile, outside the studio, word was spreading. Local news vans had begun to arrive, hoping to catch audience members for interviews. After the show, reporters who had skipped covering the Eastwood interview, thinking it would be just another celebrity promotion, were now rushing to the scene. Inside the control room, Susan White's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with text messages. The network president is watching, she told her team. Says to keep going as long as Eastwood wants to talk. Alan Porter whistled softly. Never seen that happen before. On the studio floor, camera operators moved carefully, trying to capture every nuance of Eastwood's expressions without disturbing the intimate atmosphere that had developed. I'm curious, John said. Was there a particular moment or story about Pope Prevost that really stood out to you? Clint shifted slightly in his chair. For a moment he looked reflective. It's almost vulnerable. An unusual sight for a man known for playing tough, stoic characters. There was this story, he began. When he was working in Peru, there was a terrible flood in a poor area. Instead of just sending help or making statements, he went there himself, stayed for days, helped people clean mud from their homes, listened to their stories. The studio was completely silent. Every person there felt they were witnessing something rare and special. Clint Eastwood. A private man by nature, sharing what moved him deeply. And you know what struck me? No cameras. No press releases about it. Someone else told the story later. He just did what needed doing. In the audience, Maria Lopez felt tears in her eyes. She had grown up in Peru before moving to America 20 years ago. The thought of someone caring about her homeland touched her heart. John leaned forward. And that connects with you? It does, Clint nodded. I've been fortunate in my life, very fortunate. But I still value people who just do the work without making a big show of it. Too much of our world is about showing off, getting attention. The real work often happens quietly. In homes across America, families sat together watching this unexpected moment unfold. In Chicago, the Sanderson family had gathered for their weekly dinner. 3 generations sat silently around the television, their food growing cold as they listened. Grandpa, I didn't know Clint Eastwood was religious, 12-year-old Emma Sanderson whispered. I don't think anyone did, honey, her grandfather replied softly. Back in the studio, John decided to explore another angle. You've played characters who often stand apart from institutions, who find their own moral path. Yet here you are, speaking admiringly about the leader of one of the world's oldest institutions. Do you see that as a contradiction? Clint chuckled, a warm sound that made several audience members smile. Good question, he said. Maybe that's the interesting thing. Prevost seems to work within the institution, but isn't defined by it. He brings his own humanity to the role. That's what I've tried to do in my work too. Behind camera 2, technician Dave Wilson nudged his colleague and whispered, Did Eastwood just compare himself to the Pope? His colleague shook her head. No. He's saying they both try to stay true to themselves. It's actually kind of beautiful. In the sound booth, Richard Edwards continued making subtle adjustments, ensuring that every word was perfectly clear. His wife was texting him repeatedly, asking if this was really happening or if the internet was making it up. It's real. He texted back during a brief moment when he could spare a hand, and it's amazing. It's on social media. Clips were already circulating. Religious leaders, film critics, and ordinary viewers were all sharing and commenting. The hashtag #EastwoodPrevo had joined #EastwoodPope at the top of trending lists. Mr. Eastwood, John said, you've directed films that often explore themes of redemption and moral growth. Unforgiven, Gran Torino, $1 Million Baby. Do you see connections between those themes and religious teachings? Clint took a moment before answering. The lines in his face seemed to deepen as he considered the question. Those stories are about people facing hard truths, he said finally. About themselves, about the world. That's what good religion should do too, I think. Help us face truth, not hide from it. In the back row of the audience, Bill Foster, a film professor at the local university, was recording every word in a small notebook. This will change how we understand his entire filmography, he whispered to himself. Susan White had moved from the control room to stand just off stage. She watched Eastwood with a mixture of awe and professional satisfaction. In 20 years of producing television, she had never seen anything like this. We've got calls coming in from religious organizations, Mary Johnson told her, holding up her tablet. They want to know if Eastwood would speak at events. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Susan cautioned. Let this moment be what it is. It's on stage. The conversation continued to flow naturally. There's something else, Clint said, his voice growing slightly softer. The audience leaned forward collectively, not wanting to miss a word. Something I've never mentioned publicly before. John felt a rush of both excitement and responsibility. Whatever was coming, it was clearly important to Eastwood. My Uncle Frank, Clint continued. My mother's brother, he actually met Prevost years ago. Back when Prevost was just a priest working in Chicago, Uncle Frank was going through a tough time, lost his job, marriage was struggling. He wasn't religious, but he wandered into this church, just looking for some quiet. The audience was completely still. 300 people barely breathed. And this young priest, Prevost, sat. With him, no preaching, no judging, just listened. Uncle Frank never forgot that. Said it was the first time he felt heard in years. In the lighting booth, Technician Jane Addams wiped away a tear. Her own father had struggled with similar issues. The thought of someone simply listening to him with compassion touched a deep chord. "Did that experience change your uncle?" John asked gently. "It did," Clint nodded. "Not in the way you might think. He didn't suddenly become religious. But he said it reminded him that kindness matters. Simple human kindness. That stayed with me when he told me the story." The camera caught audience members nodding, some wiping away tears. This personal connection between an American film icon and the new leader of the Catholic Church felt like worlds colliding in the most unexpected and beautiful way. "Did you ever tell Pope Prevost about this connection?" John asked. "No," Clint shook his head slightly. "Never had the opportunity. Uncle Frank passed away years ago. But watching Prevost now in his new role, I think about that story often." On the monitors in the control room, Mary Johnson pointed to the social media feeds. "Vatican officials are watching this interview. They're responding in real time." Alan Porter leaned in, reading the tweets. "They remember Frank Eastwood. They actually remember him?" Susan's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" On stage, unaware of this development, the conversation continued to deepen. Susan White stared at her phone in disbelief. The message from the network president was clear. "This is television gold. Get Vatican response on air if possible." She quickly wrote a note and handed it to a production assistant who hurried too. John Miller sighed during a brief moment when Clint was taking a sip of water. John glanced at the note, his eyes widening slightly before he composed himself. "Mr. Eastwood," John said, when Clint set his glass down. "This may sound unusual, but we're receiving word that Vatican officials are watching this interview live. They claim to remember your Uncle Frank from Chicago." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the audience. Clint's expression changed to one of genuine surprise, a rare sight for a man known for his controlled demeanor. "Is that right?" he asked quietly. In the audience, Betty Morgan grabbed Nancy Clark's arm. "Did you hear that? The Vatican is watching this?" Nancy nodded, too stunned to speak. Around them, people were whispering excitedly, some pulling out phones. Despite the no-recording policy, security guards looked to Susan for guidance, but she shook her head. "Let them record. This moment deserved to be shared." "We're trying to get more details," John explained. "But it seems your uncle made quite an impression." Clint looked down for a moment, collecting his thoughts. When he looked up, there was a softness in his eyes that few had ever seen before, certainly not in his famous movie roles. "Uncle Frank would have gotten a kick out of that," he said with a slight smile. "He was a simple man. Worked hard all his life. Never thought himself important. To think the Pope remembers him." He shook his head slightly, seemingly at a loss for words. In homes across America, viewers were calling family members to the television. In a small apartment in Boston, Jake Phillips had been watching basketball when his phone exploded with text messages. "Dude, turn on Channel 7 now. Eastwood is talking about the Pope and it's wild." Jake switched channels and was immediately captivated. As a film student working on a thesis about Eastwood's directing style, this unexpected glimpse into the man's personal thoughts and family history was priceless. Back in the studio, production assistant hurried to Susan with a tablet. "We've got a statement from Vatican Communications," she whispered urgently. Susan scanned it quickly, then wrote another note for John. The audience watched with bated breath as the note was delivered, and John read it. "Mr. Eastwood," John said, his voice carrying a hint of awe, "we've just received a statement from Vatican Communications. It says, and I quote, 'His Holiness Pope Robert Prevost remembers with fondness his time serving in Chicago and the many souls he encountered there. The story of Frank Eastwood resonates with him as an example of the meaningful connections formed in pastoral work." The audience gasped collectively. Clint Eastwood sat perfectly still, his face showing more emotion than many had ever seen from him. For a brief moment, the tough guy image that had defined his career melted away, revealing simply a man touched by an unexpected connection. "Well," Clint said finally, his voice slightly rougher than before, "that's something, isn't it?" In the control room, Mary Johnson was monitoring the social media explosion. "This is beyond viral," she told Alan Porter. "Major news networks are breaking into their programming to report on this interview." Alan nodded, his eyes fixed on the monitors. I've been in television for 25 years, never seen anything like this. On stage, John sensed the profound nature of the moment. Does this connection mean something special to you? He asked. Gently, Clint took his time answering. The studio was completely silent. Even the usual small sounds of a television production, papers rustling, quiet footsteps, whispered directions, had ceased. Everyone waited. Clint began. In my films, I've often explored coincidence. Those moments that seem random, but might not be. Moments that connect people across time and space in ways they never expected. He paused. I'm not a man who talks much about fate or divine plans. Never have been. But this... ... He shook his head slightly. This makes you wonder, doesn't it? In the audience, Greg Harris, the youth counselor, felt goosebumps. Tomorrow, he would tell this story to the troubled teenagers he worked with, how even Clint Eastwood, the ultimate tough guy, could be moved by unexpected connections and the memory of kindness. Maria Lopez, the Peruvian-American woman, was quietly crying. To her, this was about more than just a celebrity and the Pope. It was about her two worlds, her Peruvian heritage and her American life coming together, in a way she never could have imagined. John leaned forward slightly. You've directed many films that touch on spirituality and moral questions. Gran Torino, Million Dollar Baby, Unforgiven. But you've rarely discussed your own spiritual beliefs. Has this changed over the years? It's a question hung in the air. It was personal, perhaps too personal, for a man known for guarding his privacy. The production team held their breath, wondering if this might be the moment when Eastwood would pull back, when the unexpected openness of the interview would end. Instead, Clint leaned forward slightly, matching John's posture. I'm not much for labels, he said, never have been. But yes, as you get older, you think more about these things, bigger questions. What matters? What lasts? He paused. I've played men who think they have all the answers. But the older I get, the more I value questions over answers. Bill Foster, the film professor, scribbled frantically in his notebook. This interview would change how people understood Eastwood's entire body of work. The spiritual undercurrents that critics had sometimes noted in his films now took on new significance. Outside the studio, the crowd had grown. Word had spread through social media, and people were gathering, hoping to catch a glimpse of Eastwood after the show. Local news reporters were doing live stand-ups, explaining the extraordinary interview taking place inside. We're witnessing what can only be described as a cultural moment, one reporter said into her camera. Clint Eastwood, an icon of American masculinity and stoicism, is having a deeply personal conversation about faith, leadership, and human connection, all sparked by his mention of Pope Robert Prevost. Back inside, Susan White had a crucial decision to make. The interview had already run twice as long as scheduled. They had bumped to other segments. But this conversation was too important to cut short. She spoke into her headset. Tell the network, we're going to let this run, the whole hour, if needed. The response came back immediately. Approved. Ratings are historic. On stage, the conversation continued to deepen. Clint said, I've played a lot of characters who stand apart, the man with no name, the outsider. But what I'm coming to appreciate more and more is connection. How we need each other. John nodded. And you see that reflected in Pope Prevost's approach to leadership. I do, Clint said. From everything I've read and heard, he understands that leadership isn't about standing apart. It's about bringing people together. As he spoke, something remarkable was happening throughout the country. People who would never normally watch a celebrity interview were tuning in. Religious leaders and film buffs, young and old, conservatives and liberals, all were drawn to this authentic moment that transcended usual divisions. In a nursing home in Florida, 90-year-old Ruth Campbell had asked the staff to wheel her television into the common area. Now 30 residents sat watching, many with tears in their eyes. I've watched his movies since I was a young woman, Ruth told the nurse beside her. To see him like this, so thoughtful, so open, It's like seeing an old friend reveal a side you never knew was there. In the studio audience, Carol Wilson, whose son was in prison, felt a surge of hope. If Clint Eastwood could find meaning in unexpected connections at his age, perhaps her son could too. Tomorrow, when she visited him, she would have a new story to share. Susan White watched from the wings, tears in her eyes. In a career built on creating television moments, she knew this was something more, something authentic that no producer could plan or script. John looked at his next question card, then set it aside. The prepared question seemed shallow now, compared to the depth of conversation that had developed naturally. "We've talked about leadership, about your uncle's experience, about finding meaning," John said. "Is there something you hope viewers take away from this conversation? Something you want people to think about?" Clint looked out at the audience, then directly into the main camera. His gaze was steady, intense in that famous way that had defined so many of his characters. But there was something else there too. A warmth, a humanity that felt new and yet somehow familiar. "Just this," he said. "Listen to each other. Really listen. It matters more than you know." As Clint Eastwood's words about listening to each other hung in the air, the entire studio sat in reverent silence. It was a moment that felt both intimate and enormous. A simple message delivered by an American icon that somehow carried the weight of profound wisdom. John Miller felt the responsibility of guiding this remarkable conversation to a meaningful conclusion. For once in his career, he wasn't thinking about ratings or his next career move. He was simply present, honored, to be part of something authentic. "Oh, those words mean a lot coming from you," John said. Someone who's observed human nature through both acting and directing for over 60 years, Clint nodded slightly. He learned things, watching people, playing characters. Trying to understand what makes us tick, he paused. The characters' people. Remember most, they're not the ones who talk the most, the ones who see clearly, who pay attention. In the production booth, the network executives had gathered around the monitors. Jerry Phillips, the head of programming, turned to his colleagues with wonder in his eyes. "We're witnessing television history," he said quietly. "This will be studied in media classes for decades." Susan White was already thinking ahead. Interview would need special handling. It wasn't just another celebrity promotional appearance. It was something that touched on leadership, faith, connection, themes that resonated far beyond entertainment. On stage, John decided to bring the conversation full circle. "We began this evening talking about your new film, and somehow found ourselves discussing Pope Prevost leadership, and even your Uncle Frank's personal experience. It's been an extraordinary journey." "Life takes unexpected turns," Clint replied, with that slight half-smile that had charmed audiences for generations, movies too, if they're any good. The audience laughed softly, a gentle release of emotion after the intensity of the past hour. "Speaking of unexpected," John said, "I understand there's a scene in your new film where your character visits a small church in a moment of crisis. Did directing that scene feel different, given what you've shared tonight?" For the first time, Clint looked slightly surprised. He hadn't expected the conversation to connect back to his film in such a meaningful way. "You know it did," he admitted. "That scene, we shot it in a real church in Montana. Small place, been there over 100 years. My character isn't religious, but he goes there looking for ... something. Peace, maybe. Answers." In the audience, Paul Davis, the film student, leaned forward. This insight into Eastwood's creative process was gold. "And directing yourself in that scene," John prompted. "I kept it simple," Clint said. "That's always been my approach. Speeches. No dramatic revelations. Just a man sitting quietly in a sacred space, thinking about his life." He paused. "Sometimes that's enough." Outside the studio, the crowd had continued to grow. What had started as a few curious onlookers was now hundreds of people. Some held signs, "We love you, Clint, and thank you for your honesty." Local police had arrived to manage the unexpected gathering. News vans from every major network lined the street. Reporters did live stand-ups explaining the phenomenon unfolding inside. What began as a standard promotional interview has evolved into something much more meaningful. One reporter said into her camera, Sources inside tell us that Clint Eastwood has been sharing personal reflections on faith, leadership, and his family's connection to Pope Robert Prevost. Back in the studio, Mary Johnson showed Susan her tablet. The Vatican has released another statement. Susan read it quickly, then wrote a note for John. As he received it, he looked up with genuine surprise. "Mr. Eastwood," John said, "we've just received word that Pope Prevost would welcome a conversation with you when his schedule permits." The Vatican Communications Office says, and I quote, "His Holiness believes personal connections that bridge different worlds are valuable in our divided times." A collective gasp went through the audience. Clint Eastwood, the movie star who had played tough loners and outsiders, being invited to speak with the Pope, was unexpected in the most wonderful way. Clint was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was slightly rougher than before. "I'd be honored," he said simply. In homes across America, viewers felt they were witnessing something historic. In Chicago, Father Michael Barnes watched with his elderly mother in their small apartment. As a young priest, he had worked alongside Prevost years ago. "That's the Robert I knew," he told his mother. "Always building bridges. Always seeing the person beneath the surface." In Hollywood, directors and actors gathered in a production office where someone had turned on the interview. They watched in stunned silence as one of their industry's most private icons spoke with such openness. He'd worked with him twice, an older actor said. Never heard him say this much about himself in all the months on set. On stage, John could feel that the interview was naturally reaching its conclusion. Not because of time constraints or commercial breaks, but because the conversation had found its natural arc. "We wrap up this extraordinary conversation." John said, "I'm curious, has this discussion tonight changed anything for you? Sharing these thoughts that you've kept private for so long?" Clint considered the question carefully. The audience waited, not wanting to miss a word. "You know," he said finally, "I've spent most of my career playing men of few words. Men who keep things inside." He gestured slightly with his hand. "There's value in that restraint. But there's also value in speaking your truth sometimes. Finding the right moment to share what matters to you." In the back of the audience, Carol Wilson wiped away tears. Tomorrow, when she visited her son in prison, she would tell him about this moment, about how it's never too late to open up, to make connections, to find meaning. "Any regrets about bringing up Pope Prevost tonight?" John asked. "You couldn't have anticipated where it would lead?" Clint shook his head. "No regrets. Some things just feel right in the moment. This did." The simplicity and honesty of his answer touched everyone who heard it. As the interview drew to a close, John asked one final question. "What's next for you, Mr. Eastwood, after this film?" Clint smiled a full, warm smile that made him look younger than his years. "I've learned not to plan too far ahead at my age, but I'm curious about what comes next, more curious than I've been in years." The audience broke into applause, not the polite applause of a talk show audience, but the genuine, emotional response of people who knew they had witnessed something authentic and meaningful. John stood and extended his hand. "Clint Eastwood, thank you for one of the most remarkable conversations of my career." As they shook hands, the applause grew louder. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the days that followed, the interview became a cultural touchstone. Clips were shared millions of times across social media platforms. Religious leaders and film critics alike wrote thoughtful analyses. Ordinary people discussed it in coffee shops, at dinner tables, in classrooms. The Vatican confirmed that arrangements were being made for a private meeting between Eastwood and Pope Prevost when the Pope visited the United States later that year. Television. Critics called it the interview that redefined celebrity conversations, a masterclass in authentic communication. Susan White received job offers from every major network, but chose to stay with Evening Conversations, which was now the highest-rated talk show in the country. John Miller found himself approached by viewers wherever he went, wanting to thank him for facilitating such a meaningful exchange. And Clint Eastwood? His new film opened to record numbers, but that seemed almost secondary. He had shared something of himself that transcended entertainment, a reflection on connection, on listening, on what matters most in life. A month after the interview, a small package arrived at Eastwood's office. Inside was a handwritten note. From Pope Robert Prevost, along with a faded photograph from the Chicago church where he had once served. In the background of the photo, barely visible but unmistakable, was Frank Eastwood. The note read simply, "Connections matter. Looking forward." To our conversation, Clint placed the photo carefully in his wallet. Some things were worth carrying with you.